This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. Today on the show, we are focusing our attention on some of the top issues on voters' minds. We're talking about everything from the environment to immigration to this.
A national tragedy, that is the housing market in America.
The United States isn't building enough homes.
Record high inflation may have people questioning whether homeownership is a good investment.
Our credit is impeccable, our savings are in check, we have zero debt, but in this market, we cannot compete.
According to Pew Research, 1 in 3 American households are cost burdened. The problem is even worse for people who rent, with at least half of renters being defined as cost burdened. Erika Poethig is a executive vice president with the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago. She's also a board member of the Illinois Housing Development Authority. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Sasha. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. Now, question off the bat, when it comes to affordable housing, I want to know what exactly is the issue?
Yeah. Without a doubt, the most important issue right now in this housing market is not enough supply. And we see that across the country. Some economists estimate it's 1.5 million units we need, up to 4 million units we need, depending upon how you calculate it.
Okay.
It's true in Chicago, too.
Yeah. How much of an issue is supply here?
So supply is an issue, but a little bit different. So in Illinois, we have new job centers that don't really have enough available housing for people to live in. Places like Bloomington, Illinois, where new plants are being built. In Chicago, it's both a combination of not enough available housing, and some of that maps to some of the patterns of economic and racial segregation that have long plagued the city. We have different kinds of housing markets in the city. But it's also an issue of not having enough investment in our existing housing stock so that we're losing units due to poor conditions, for instance.
And when we talk affordable housing, what does affordable mean? How is that defined?
So typically what HUD, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and in federal law, says the important gauge from a household budget standpoint is you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income for housing. So we use that as the benchmark. So you mentioned it at the top. In the U.S., there are 22.4 million renter households, for instance, that are paying more than 30% of their housing. That's double than what it was back in the 1960s, for instance.
Right.
We are just what it costs to build and operate housing is far outstripping the incomes that people have to pay for that housing.
So affordable housing, that's an issue here as well. So we're starting to see a pattern here,
Yep.
Erika. Now, according to a WBEZ analysis, nearly half of renters in the city pay more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. Just last night, we hear that Chicago Housing Authority CEO Tracy Scott announced that she'd be stepping down. This is following criticism that the CHA hasn't done enough to address this city's affordable housing shortage. Housing's a local issue. So what can the federal government really do?
Well, so one thing I want to say is I want to give Tracy Scott credit where credit's due. She was in a very complicated and difficult job and did create 3,000 new units as a part of the plan for transformation. I think one of the places that she's been criticized really points to the issue that you've just named, which is most of the resources for the Chicago Housing Authority come from the federal government, and most of them come as rental assistance. And we have tens of thousands of people on waiting lists for rental assistance because they don't have enough income to pay for what housing costs to operate. And people stay on those waiting lists for years because we haven't added new rental assistance for the most part in the budget. I was in the Biden-Harris administration, and each year we ask Congress to allocate more resources for rental assistance so that more of those people can come off the waiting list and afford housing. Congress added about 25,000 new vouchers. If you look across the country, that's not much when you think about what that means for Chicago. So first and foremost, we need more rental assistance to help places like Chicago serve more of those people with the not enough incomes to pay for housing.
So earlier we talked about both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's policies on immigration. There seems to be a clear connection between Trump's plan for immigration and housing. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So President Trump has limited details in his housing plan and strategy, but the one he leads the most with is deportation as a housing strategy.
Yeah.
So let me say why that will not result in reducing the housing affordability challenges that people face.
And before you do that, let me give folks one of his exact quotes.
Yep.
This is from his website. It says, quote, Republicans will secure the border, deport illegal aliens, and reverse the Democrats' open borders policies that have driven up the cost of housing, education, and healthcare for American families. Then it continues by saying, quote, Republicans will end luxury housing and taxpayer benefits for illegal immigrants and use those savings to shelter and treat homeless veterans. End quote.
Yeah. So if we just look at the most recent period during COVID, where we've seen these incredible increases, especially in rents and in the cost of buying a home, this is a period where we've had also relatively lower rates of immigration. Mm-hmm. So that just on its face is false in terms of that relationship that he's drawn. But I would also say that many people are in mixed status families. That means that some people are legally here and some people have a different status, and that might subject them to deportation. Mm-hmm. So the idea that deportation may take somebody out of a household doesn't mean the whole housing unit becomes available. It just means one person's left and that household may be destabilized because they don't have the income to pay for the housing, so they may be more subject to eviction.
But some people will still live in that home.
So I would say that is definitely one important fallacy in the policy in this relationship that he's drawing.
According to the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, and the immigrant advocacy group, the National Immigration Forum, both documented and undocumented immigrants play a huge role in the construction labor force in this country and across the globe. What kind of impact would the deportation of immigrants have on the housing supply?
Yeah, I'm so glad you cited that. And it's the Cato Institute, right? And this is true. Like Jim Tobin, who's head of the National Association of Home Builders, also not a liberal lefty group, also has pointed out that 1/3 of the workforce that makes housing are foreign born. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons why we have a housing supply challenge today is after the great financial crisis, many of the people working in the housing industry left because the bottom fell out. And we haven't been able to get those folks to come back into the housing industry. So if you lose a third or a third of your workforce is destabilized as a result of a deportation policy, we're going to only see more slow supply, higher prices, not lower prices, not more availability.
This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. How will the plans and policies of presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump impact housing here in Illinois and Chicago? We're joined by Erika Poethig, who is with the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago, as well as the Illinois Housing Development Authority. I want to zoom in, Erika, on one portion of Kamala Harris's housing plan. Now, she plans to offer up $25,000 in down payment assistance to first-time homebuyers. We've been hearing her tout this nonstop, really, since the debate. Her campaign claims that this would help more than 4 million first-time buyers, and it will cost $100 billion. Now, economists are worrying that if you give people down payment assistance without addressing the issue that you and I have been talking about, which is supply, without addressing that first, will that actually just make housing prices worse? Which one needs to happen first?
Yeah. So they both need to happen at the same time. And let me also say why this policy is so important for Chicago, and particularly for closing racial and ethnic wealth gaps that we see in this city. So undoubtedly, you have to add to supply in order to adjust prices and give people some place to go and lower the competition for each available unit, which is what we're seeing now. Where a supplement in down payment assistance could potentially be reflected in housing prices. But there's a feature of this policy which has also been advanced that is not necessarily her policy, but I wanted to elevate it here, which is the idea of a first-generation, first-time home ownership benefit for down payment assistance. Okay. And that's important because if you come from a family that has intergenerational wealth, and more white households have more intergenerational wealth than Black and Latin households, you typically have some of that resource to put to a down payment, whereas you may not have that if you don't come from a family that has had the benefit of home ownership.
Right.
So, for instance, in Chicago, 7 out of 10 white Chicagoans are homeowners. 5 out of 10 Latin Chicagoans are homeowners, but 1/3 of Black Chicagoans are homeowners. So they haven't had that same generational wealth to enable that next generation to buy that home,
Right.
which is why that down payment assistance is so important, because it allows you to compete for homes in the marketplace, whereas you might not otherwise be able to do, and also lower the costs of homeownership.
But where would the money come from for something like
Well,
this?
it has to be allocated by Congress, and most of her policies are would require congressional action.
Yeah. So there's another crucial piece to Harris's housing plan. Let's listen.
We are going to cut red tape and work with the private sector to build 3 million new homes by the end of my first term.
So how does she plan on doing that, Erika? She says we're going to, quote, cut red tape and work with the private sector.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So first of all, let me just say work with the private sector. So most of her policies that equate to the 3 million new units are by boosting existing tax credits, like the low-income housing tax credit for rental housing, which she would add it, increase the tax credit so you build an additional 1 million homes for renters through that policy. That's a public-private partnership. So she means that there's a new tax credit she also is proposing called the Neighborhood Homes Tax Credit, be particularly important in Chicago, where we have a lot of neighborhoods where it just doesn't pencil out due to appraisal bias. So she's got two policies on that level, which are about public-private partnership. The Cutting the Red Tape initiative that she refers to in that speech is about her $40 billion local innovation fund. It's kind of like a race to the top for housing. So if you remember in the education context, what that program did was say, if you change these laws, states, you can compete for these funds to go into education. Similarly, she's saying, if you reduce the red tape, and which the city of Chicago, for instance, has a Reduce the Red Tape initiative.
Right.
If you reduce the red tape, maybe you make it more easy to build accessory dwelling units, which are a form of affordable rental housing, for instance, or you take some other steps to make the process easier, you are eligible for and can compete for these funds to bring down the cost of housing.
One part of Trump's plan I want to briefly mention is reducing regulatory hurdles to building new homes. What's the hurdle that he's talking
Well,
about?
I'm not sure because he doesn't provide a lot of detail, and the federal government doesn't have many levers to influence those hurdles at the federal level.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what he's referring to.
So both candidates, though, Harris and Trump, they've suggested easing zoning laws. When we talk about zoning laws in Chicago to build housing, what do we know? And what are their ideas for easing those zoning laws?
Well, neither of them lists those specifically, although I would say that what Trump has done is call out the multifamily housing
Okay.
as something that he doesn't want to be in suburbs because he wants to preserve single family housing
Okay.
in suburbs. So he has said that in speeches.
I will say Harris is proposing a $40 billion fund.
Yes, that's what I meant. So a
Yeah.
$40 billion fund, and that is to incentivize zoning changes. And she identifies some places across the country that have taken steps to be able to do that. For instance, you have Minneapolis, which has it had areas that you could only build single family housing in. It now has areas where they're promoting more rental properties and building that throughout the city. So eliminating barriers to the building of rental housing is one of the principal ways that folks can do that. In Chicago, I think what's meaningful is I mentioned accessory dwelling units just a moment ago.
Yes.
And these are opportunities for homeowners to convert. Sometimes it's a basement unit. Sometimes it's an attic. Sometimes it's a apartment on the top of a garage. We don't have as much flexibility in Chicago as we could to facilitate homeowners creating more housing units
Yeah.
out of their existing housing. That would be a way for us here to reduce the red tape and create more flexibility and opportunity to enable homeowners to actually generate income to help them stay in their homes, but also provide a form of rental housing.
One more note on this housing topic before I let you go, Erika. Another plan where they seem to align, this is on opening up the use of federal land. So what are we talking about here when it comes to Chicago and Illinois? How much federal land do we have, and is that a good idea?
Yeah. So here, Trump doesn't provide much detail, and the Harris plan does provide a lot more detail. And they refer to the Bureau of Land Management, which is in the Department of the Interior. A lot of that land is in the western part of the United States. So the way I think about it in this context for Chicago is to look at the policies that the General Service Administration uses when it's disposing of a federal asset like a office building. And under that policy, there are improvements that can be made. The first priority when the federal government does dispose of an asset like a commercial building is for homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
But there are ways in which we can make that policy work better to provide wider opportunities for affordable housing. So I look at that and I think it's a nod in the direction of making those working with Congress to make those policies work better so that more federal properties can be used for the purposes of housing.
We'll leave it there. Erika Poethig is the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Planning at the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago, board member of the Illinois Housing Development Authority, and former Special Assistant to President Joe Biden for Housing and Urban Policy on the White House Domestic Policy Council, which she left back in May of 2023.
Yes.
Thank you, Erika.
Thank you, Sasha.
Good to see you.
you.